say there are two opinions. First, we'll discuss the one that holds that it's shahako, and they bring Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and they say that the bracha is downgraded to shahako because the peanuts that are ground, they're not ground to improve the taste, and even chunky peanut butter is shahako, and that's the way the OU paskins. Yeah. There is a Lubavitch book. 1 second. Okay, so the Lubavitch book here, 1 second, where am I? The Lubavitch book here, interestingly, divides it up. He says smooth should be shahako, and crunchy would be hardama. However, there is a type in which the majority is smooth with pieces. The bracha is then as the majority shahako. So I think they're basically deciding that it should be shahako.
Shahako, all right.
So, you don't go wrong if you recite a shahako, but the question is if they were aware when they wrote this book that the majority of peanuts are made into peanut butter. That's really a question. In other words, over the years, we come to know more statistical information. We didn't always have it at our fingertips. So because there's room to say that if there's room to say that if majority of peanuts are made into peanut butter, it could be everyone would agree. They're quoting two views here. They're saying shahako because of two views. That's the sort. That's their reason of saying shahako. But even that view that it should be shahako could be that it would say ha'adama. So if someone were to make a ha'adama, even a Lubavitcher, I wouldn't look at them as if they're wrong. I would look at them as if maybe they actually are more right. At the same time, because it says to say shahako, and you definitely get yourself out of any problem. So shahako is probably the easiest way out. But I would be leaning towards saying it should be ha'adama. That would be my leaning. But and the reason being because the fact is because we know that statistics of majority, that majority is that it's made into peanut butter. But when I eat peanut butter plain, it's hard to say. I sort of like rethink this whole discussion every time, and probably sometimes I probably conclude that my view is right and should be hadama, or sometimes I probably follow I know the book says that the common view is shahako. Shahako covers all opinions. I probably should have a set. I should follow a set rule, but somehow I reevaluate every time. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say I think it's a new phenomenon, peanut butter, because I think a black man invented it not too long ago.
Okay, all right.
So I don't know that the rabbis knew about peanut butter.
Yeah, no, but they write about it. But my point is, I don't know if they knew the statistics as we know it. You know what I mean? Now there's a lot of information on the internet, and we're able to find out what majority is made into peanut butter. I don't know if that information was so available, 30 years ago.
Rabbi, I'm thinking that the technology that they didn't realize wasn't the majority of peanuts is peanut butter or not. The technology is how do you make crunchy peanut butter? In the olden days, they used to think it was a crunchy grind. They set the grinder in the peanut butter to crunchy, and that was actual real peanut butter. They didn't realize the technology which is coming out now, that all the major companies make smooth peanut butter and just add the pieces afterwards.
Right.
So maybe that's the technology they didn't know about.
Yeah, well, that's also true. You're correct about that as well. That they probably weren't aware of the inside store inside information of what the companies do to make things easier for them. That's correct. They probably didn't have that information, which we somehow get these type of this information nowadays because someone slips and puts it on the internet. But they used to try to hide all that stuff so that no one would be able to copy, and compete with them. So in any event, yeah, you're right about that as well. I agree with you, David. You're right. So the lucky thing is the Hechsherim, the Kashrus organizations, they're the ones who sort of can tell us a little about this. The only problem is a lot of them have to sign non-disclosure agreements when they go into factories. Like Coca-Cola is not allowing someone in there if they're not going to sign they're not going to sign a document saying that they're not going to disclose any of the information. So like a lot of companies do that, and that's where we get into we don't get the full information because they're not allowed to reveal it. So in any event, that's the story with companies. Let's go back to the Gemara. So the Gemara that we've been learning, we spoke about the pas tsunuma baka'ara, this bread that is been somehow become wet with some type of soup, and it's been broken up either before it was put into this soup or it's been broken. It was very hard bread and it dissolved by the hot water being poured in it, or it being put into this hot soup. But it's in a dish and it's broken into pieces. And the Gemara says, "Mevarchen alaha hamoitzi lachem hamoitzi." We recite the bracha of hamoitzi. And Tosfos tells us, as we mentioned yesterday, that the Gemara is not telling us a new law that you recite hamoitzi on pieces of bread that are in a soup, because we learned about the details of that law way back a few pages earlier, and that there are rules at what stage does it retain its hamoitzi and what stage it loses it. And so this law here that the Gemara brings, Reb Chia bar Ashi says that pas tsunuma baka'ara, this bread that's hard bread in this bowl, that you're going to recite a hamoitzi. He's not telling you the bracha's hamoitzi. We know the bracha's hamoitzi. So the purpose of the Gemara bringing this, and Reb Chia bar Ashi saying this, is to tell you that this is a preferred option of reciting hamoitzi on this food item instead of reciting it maybe on another bread that's not broken into pieces. And you have the option of reciting it on this. And the logic behind it is that, and Tosfos brings this, that it's chaviva, that you cherish this, you're interested in eating this, and it's considered important because it's chaviv to you. You enjoy this much more than maybe a whole bread. So it's considered like a whole bread because it's to you, you cherish this. And therefore, Reb Chia bar Ashi is saying you can recite the hamoitzi blessing on this. You don't have to say, all right, I'm going to recite it on the large loaf that's right here. You don't do that. You don't need to do that. Now, this argues on Reb Chia because Reb Chia says that you really should recite the hamoitzi on a whole loaf. And he says that at the end of reciting the hamoitzi, you start slicing the loaf. And this obviously is an argument because Reb Chia is arguing with Reb Chia bar Ashi. So we have the two names, Reb Chia and Reb Chia. One of them is Reb Chia bar Ashi. He's the more lenient one. He says, do what you enjoy. And Reb Chia, without the bar Ashi, he's the one who says that you follow the sholem, the fact that it's complete. And and you recite the bracha on a complete loaf, and at the end of the bracha, you start slicing it. And on this, Rava says, what? What are you gaining? Your whole thing is to do your whole goal is to recite a bracha on something whole. What did you do right after? You slice it before you finish the bracha? At least finish the bracha on the whole and then slice it. What are you gaining? You're telling us you want to make it on the whole bracha. You recite a bracha on the whole loaf, and then you go and slice it right before right by the end. You finish it on a broken loaf. That then you're missing the boat, missing the point. So the Gemara says that so Rava holds that you have to cut it only after you finish the bracha. Yes, Robert.
I guess what I'm reading, hopefully I'm not after what you're talking about, but again, it's only for wheat bread. And that has the dominance of being able to make the bracha. And then if you have a loaf of barley, it doesn't count. You don't have to make the bracha. But
you
what
are
happens?
on a Gemara that's later. You're on a Gemara that's later, but you're asking the question that if you recite a hamaitzi, does that cover all the breads? That's what you're basically touching on.
Yeah.
It doesn't only cover all the breads, it covers the entire meal, except food that's not normally served in a meal, like dessert, is like extras. So everything would be covered. Once you recite that hamaitzi, you could have spelt bread in the meal. You could have oat bread. You could have chicken and potatoes, and whatever you want to have in the borscht. Everything is covered in your meal. And once you recite that one hamaitzi.
So ostensibly, if you don't know the character of the bread, you're covered by doing the bracha for hamotzi.
Well, so that's a different thing. If you don't know the character of the bread, meaning you're not sure what it's made out of, it's wheat, rye, or spelt, or whatever. But if it might be cornbread, then you have a problem. You can't recite hamotzi because cornbread, which is somewhat popular, is not hamaitzi. It would be shahako cornbread.
Different species. Okay.
It's not from the 5 grains.
Right.
Corn.
Got it. Okay.
And so if you're not sure if it's cornbread, then you got to step back and try to figure out what bread. Otherwise, you might have to recite a shahako, on it. If it looks like it would look like cornbread, which would be more yellowish, I guess, and
grainy. Cornbread is a lot more grainy than regular bread.
And maybe lighter.
Rough texture. It's a rougher texture. I think it's a rougher texture. It's the best way I can put it.
Right. Okay. Now, but I should also mention that if the cornbread has wheat, sometimes it has some wheat flour in it. So it has some wheat flour in it, then it would seem to be a hamaitzi. Again, even if it's cornbread.
And a corn muffin?
And a corn muffin as well. Corn muffin, something you have to always find out is if there's wheat flour in it. If they advertise the corn muffin as gluten-free, then there's no wheat flour in it. And then you know that it's a shahako muffin. But very often, corn muffins are mezainis because they're just giving some, corn flour flavor. They're adding some corn flour into it, but it has wheat flour. It's really wheat flour, which we would recite a mezainis on the corn muffin.
Rabbi.
So,
Rabbi.
Yeah.
What about tortilla? Tortilla bread.
Tortilla is ground flour.
Before I talk about tortilla, let me just read for you the Art Scroll book, Rabbi Force. He says cornbread with grain flour. He says it could be considered mezainos if you're not making a meal out of it. Otherwise, it's hamaitzi if it has wheat flour. Why does he say mezainos? So he has a number 20 here, takes you to the back of it. He says that assuming that the cornbread has a distinct corn taste and is more like cake than bread, then if you're not eating a large amount of it, it would be considered mezainis. If, however, the cornbread is fit to be eaten as a bread, or one eats it as or with a meal, one recites a hamaitzi. So what he's saying is sometimes cornbread would be more like cake. And I think he's right when it comes to like a corn muffin, because they make the corn muffins as if they're cookies. It's like,
well, it's more dense. It's more dense than bread.
Right. No, but people think, oh, we're eating a muffin, which is like healthy. These brand muffins, really, it's like a piece of cake that they're eating, because they fill it with sugar and oil and who knows what. But what he's saying is, I guess maybe cornbread, sometimes they do the same thing. But if it's made like bread, he says, if it's fit to be eaten as bread, one recites a hamaitzi, as I mentioned earlier. So that would be with regard to cornbread. Now, if it doesn't have grain flour, it's shahakal and burn nefashos. Now, one thing that's the reason I'm thinking now, does it, in order to recite a berachas hamazon, I have to look this up, but I think there's an argument if you need to have kazayas, a size of an olive, within the size of 6 olives, 3 eggs of wheat flour. In other words, how little wheat flour in the cornbread would still require a berachas hamazon. In other words, there might have to be a measurement. It could be it's an argument if there's a measurement of a kazayas, which means 1/6. It could be it needs to have 1/6 wheat flour, at least minimum 1/6 of it wheat flour. So if you have, let's say, 5 cups of corn flour and 1 cup of wheat flour in the cornbread, so that would require berachas hamazon. If it's less than that, let's say it's a 1/2 cup of wheat flour and 6 cups of corn flour, so then I think it's an argument if it would be a hamaitzi. They don't bring it here, but I'm just guessing. Let me see if this book has it with regard to cornbread. Cornbread containing 5 grains. They just say hamaitzi. Oh, but they say corn muffins. One says al hamichya as the concluding bracha only if there is a kazayas of flour of the 5 in a pras within 6 kazesim of the mixture of the corn muffins. So they do mention it regarding the corn muffins. I wonder if the same thing would apply to the bread. I would assume so, but they mention it regarding the muffins that you only say in al hamichya if you have 1/6 of the muffin, at least 1/6 of it is flour, is wheat flour. And so, and that, which would mean if there was 5 cups of corn flour and a 1/2 cup of wheat flour, you would not recite an al hamichya because of this argument. There is an argument if you would recite or not. And they're saying you would follow that. You'd follow the lenient view. Don't recite an al hamichya. Yes, Susan.
I believe the reason for the wheat flour is to bind it together. I believe. When you say it's a corn muffin?
I don't know. Because I think that they really are just giving you, like whole wheat bread that you buy in a bakery. It's really whole white. Whole wheat bread you buy in a bakery. I'm giving you an example. Whole wheat bread you buy in a bakery. How much of it is whole wheat? How much of it is white?
None of it. None of it is whole wheat.
I would say it's about maybe 75 or 80% white, right. Maybe about 20 or 15% whole wheat. So I think the same thing might be with some of the corn muffins. They're basically making cake and they're giving a certain flavor corn to it. But it's probably majority even wheat because it's like cake, and they're just giving it the corn flour. And I'm guessing that corn flour is probably more expensive than wheat flour because wheat flour is much more popular. So that would also be a reason to assume that they fill it up with as much wheat flour as possible, right. And the corn flour is probably less. But you may be right. I am not sure if it is used as
Only
a
because I
bind.
bake, I do a lot of baking, and if something is falling apart, I know I didn't add enough binder.
Right, right. But I'm guessing that when you buy a corn muffin, often
Right.
it's a nice amount. It's more than 1/6 flour,
Right.
wheat flour,
Right.
unless they claim it's gluten free. That's
Let's
my
not even
thought,
go
but
there,
I
Rabbi.
don't know. Anyway, it's something to look into. I guess we should. It becomes problematic because
Yes.
you don't know, you get into situations where you can't find out. You buy it in the store, it's a mix, or you buy it at the bakery bakes it, but you're buying it at the restaurant, and they don't know the measurements that the bakery does. So
Right.
you get yourself into, it does become problematic. That's why it's nice for some of the places, they write the bracha on it. Some of the hechsherim, they tell you what the bracha is.
On the matzah that I buy, the gluten-free matzah, they put the blessing on the outside of the box.
Right. Well, that's important because that matzah is very, it's a automatic mistake that people are going to make when they buy the matzah. They think it's hamaitzi. It's very prone to tricking people, to causing people to make mistakes. So Moshe wanted to know what bracha on tortillas.
Yeah, but tortillas can be either wheat or corn, so you need to distinguish when you buy them what they are.
Right, for sure. So the bracha here is from the OU. The bracha for corn tortillas or tortilla chips is shahakol, because the identity of corn is lost when ground into flour. Even if the corn flour is made into dough and is baked, the bracha remains shahakol. The corn has permanently lost its identity. Interestingly, the 5 grains also lose their identity when ground into flour. The bracha is shahakol, but when kneaded and baked, the dough is transformed into bread, and the bracha is elevated to hamaitzi. Furthermore, if a bread is made from a majority of corn flour and a minority of wheat flour, the bracha is hamaitzi because the wheat flour is always considered the primary. Nonetheless, for such bread, brachas hamazon is only recited if the portion that one eats contains a kazayas of wheat flour. It has to at least have a kazayas of wheat flour. For example, if a loaf of bread is made from 1 kazayas of wheat flour and 2 kazasim of corn flour, one would have to eat 3 kazasim of the bread to recite the brachas hamazon. And this is also is an argument, but the OU is saying you need to eat an actual olive size of wheat flour. Not everyone agrees with that. Some say that as long as you eat a olive size portion and the mixture contained enough wheat flour in it, that's enough to recite the after blessing. But they're saying they're following that view that you need to have a full kazayas of the a full olive size of wheat flour itself. Anyway, so regarding the bracha on corn tortillas, it's shahakol, and the same thing is tortilla chips, which would be different than corn chips, because on corn chips, let's just pull up the interesting. Well, they say the bracha on corn chips is shahakol also, because it's ground into. I guess that makes sense. It's ground into flour. But the interesting thing is the brachas, the Lubavitch brachas book says corn chips would be ha'adama, and the Rabbi Forrest would say corn chips. See, these are not tortilla chips. Corn chips, let's see what he says. Corn chips, he does say shahakol. Interesting. I guess it boils down to why are they saying that it should be ha'adama? I guess they're saying it's not ground up as much, or you can tell maybe. Why are they saying that it's ha'adama here? I always was taught that it's ha'adama, and they are claiming the same thing. Interesting. I'm thinking now, like, well, I guess it also boils down to the question of corn flakes cereal. The cornflake cereal, there used to be, I don't know if people still do this. Kellogg's, they used to claim one of their cornflakes, or maybe whatever, they only have one type, is the bracha ha'adama, but all other companies are shahako. And the reason they said that was that Kellogg's does not really grind their corn into corn flakes. They really press it, while all the other companies are using corn flour to make their cornflakes cereal. And Kellogg's is different. I don't know if that's still the way it is, and if they is that only a type of, they, you know, I don't know if it was one of the types that Kellogg's made, or do they only make one type, but let me just see if it could be this art scroll might say something about cornflakes. Conventional, produced from flattened corn kernels, cornflakes are hadama. Produced from corn flour are shahako. So I think the Lubavitch book is believing that the corn chips are made from the same thing. They're like, they believe it was flattened and produced from flattened corn kernels instead of from corn flour. But in any event, it seems like there's an argument here about the corn chips. Corn flakes, supposedly, they do make some corn flakes from flattened corn flour and corn from flattened corn kernels. And in that case, it didn't really lose wasn't totally broken up from its form, and that would cause it to be a hadama. Yes, David.
Yeah, two things. Number one, I just saw an article like a couple of weeks ago about cornflakes and how do you tell the difference between one and the other.
Oh,
so if
okay.
you pull out a few flakes and they're all different shapes, that's like cornflakes. That's
natural.
That's natural. And if you pull out a few flakes and they all are the same shape,
right,
then that's made from corn flour, and that would be like a shakol. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, David. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The second thing is I used to run the Mesiva Shabbos. I used to consult with Rabbi Marlowe about Brochos. So, and I have these two bracha booklets, both with an approbation from Rabbi Marlowe Senior, and one says shakol, one says adama. Why? Because the people on corn chips.
Corn chips, okay.
And why? Because the people that say hadama say that you can see the pieces of these. You can see pieces in the corn chips. You can see it on the corn chips, not necessarily corn, but you can see some kind of material, some kind of vegetable material in the corn chip. Whereas the people that say shakol says no, it's so thoroughly ground you don't really see it. So that's why there's a difference of opinion. But they're both Lubavitch booklets. One's from Rabbi Wenger, one's from Rabbi Newman, and they both were looked at by Rab Marlowe, and one says shakol and one says hadama. So what I would do with the kids is I would tell them, some people say one, some people say another. So it's better to say a bracha on a different thing, like a potato chip, and then say the shakol on something else, and you have in mind. Or you can ask your parents what they want to do, because I don't want to tell kids.
Right.
Yeah.
Or just say shakol. Yeah,
but if
it is
the
interesting.
hadama was more fitting, then it's better to say hadama. So I told them to ask your parents if they're not sure, or ask Rabbi Marlowe, or you're exempt it with a different bracha, with a different food.
Have you tested your measuring with the cornflakes? Like, did you do did you do it? So
yeah,
Kellogg's.
I saw it. I didn't do it by Kellogg's brand, but I saw that some brands do that. And some brands it's uniform, and some brands it's different per flake.
Right. Okay. All right.
No,
Sounds good. Yes, Robert.
apropos, I've never realized the same thing with potato chips. You have potato chips that again
Pringles.
are real, and Pringles,
Right.
there's like, Walmart has a facsimile. There are other
Uh-huh.
ones, and the same thing. They're cookie cutter, they're reconstituted potatoes, and God knows whatever else they throw in it as well.
Right. That's right. So the bracha, right, on Pringles would be shahakol, and the bracha on regular potato chips would be hadama. Good example, Robert. Yes, Susan.
There used to be a seafood company in Coral Gables that would make fresh, homemade potato chips as an appetizer. The guy would come in early, slice the potatoes, and fry them. There is nothing in this world that tastes like a fresh fried. It's incredible taste. Incredible. That was one of their.
I'm sure you never tried it, Susan. I'm sure it was not kosher.
No.
She only heard about it secondhand.
Right.
That's what they told you.
I worked in the restaurant when I was 17 years old. When I was 17, I worked in the restaurant.
Not that one, not that restaurant, I'm sure.
Right.
Okay.
And a seafood restaurant on
Right.
top.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Like Vegas Mayor, right?
Uh-huh. Right.
Seafood, SEE, right.
Very good. Okay, so let's get back to what we were talking about here. We have this bread that's broken into pieces, and then we spoke about the bracha. Should you recite the bracha completely before you cut it, or should you start the cutting and conclude the cutting at the end of the bracha? Now, Rava doesn't like this idea of concluding the cutting at the end. He says, well, what are you gaining? You end up reciting the bracha on a non-complete loaf. So the Gemara concludes and says, Hilchas Karava, the halacha follows Rava. Now, Tosfos over here tells us that what is Rava really saying? What he's saying is not that you can't make a slice in the bread. You can, but don't make a slice. Don't separate the piece until after the bracha. And some have a custom to say hamoitzi, the complete bracha, before they cut it, so that it's complete and you don't have any slice at all in it, and then you finish the bracha and then slice it. And Tosfos says that's wrong, because that is causing there to be an interruption. It's called a hesach hadas. Now, obviously, it's not a Tosfos doesn't mean that it's prohibited. It's not preferable. It's not preferable to do that. This is not an official hesach hadas. This is not a real hesach hadas interruption that would cause you to have to recite another bracha and so on. It's not a legal hesach hadas, but it's preferable not to do it this way. So it's better to make some type of a slice in the bread beforehand. Now, I should mention that if you slice the bread before you finish reciting the bracha, so it really depends how much you slice it, if it's called a shaling, a complete loaf. If you slice it in a way that if you hold the bread by the slice, it's going to fall, the rest of the bread will fall off. That means you sliced it too much. It's not complete anymore, even though it is attached. But attached is not considered one piece if it wouldn't hold. In other words, if you cut it more than 3/4, it's already probably going to cause the rest of the loaf to fall apart if you would hold the loaf by this piece. So because of that, when you make some type of a slice in the bread, which is going to make it faster when you finish reciting the bracha, you want to be able to slice the bread right away. So you have your mark in it, that there is a tradition to make a mark in the bread, and that's what we do on Shabbos. We make a mark in the bread. Tosfos says better not to do anything on Shabbos. Tosfos is concerned that if you end up slicing too much, you won't have lechem mishnah. And how much is too much? The amount that's too much is if you cut it more than, you're not going to be able to hold that piece and the rest of the bread would fall off. That's cutting it too much. We're not afraid you're going to cut the piece off, but you might cut it too much that it'll cause it not to be legally called a complete loaf. So what I'm sharing with you is the fact that there is an amount that if you cut, it will not be considered complete. And that amount would be if you would hold it and the rest of the bread would fall off from it. That would mean that it's not that you've cut too much. And so on Shabbos, we have to be concerned about lechem mishnah. So because of the concern of lechem mishnah, better don't cut it at all, according to Tosfos. Now, our custom, the common custom is to make a little mark, but don't make a cut in it. If you don't make a cut in the bread, then you don't have to worry at all. Now, this idea, I think, answers a question. It was a question that bothered me. The question that bothered me before was, what was Reb Chia's advice on how to cut the bread? He said, finish the bracha with slicing the bread. Rava didn't like that, but Reb Chia said this is the way to do it. You finish the bracha, and as you say the last word of the bracha, you're cutting it. So my question was, well, what's wrong really? You finish the bracha on a whole loaf, and the second you finish the saying of the bracha is when you sever it. So it is, your bracha is on a whole loaf, right? Because at the end, your end words, you're actually doing the final severing. And so if you're doing the final severing at the end word, the last word, you say the word, and as you stop saying the word, you make the final sever. That should be a bracha on a whole loaf, right? So what's wrong? What's Rava's argument? You're not doing it on the whole. Reb Chia doesn't say to cut it, to finish cutting it before you finish the bracha. He says finish it at the same time. So what's Rava's argument that it's not good? So to answer that problem that was bothering me, there's two points. One is maybe it's impossible to. Sometimes you're gonna cut it you're gonna end up cutting it before. It's hard to make it exactly at the same moment. That's one point that maybe Rava's arguing with. And the other point is it doesn't have to do with severing it. This is what I'm seeing from the law about severing, that since the law is that once you cut it too much, it's already considered separated, even if it's attached, but legally it's called separate. It's not a shalem anymore. So Rava's arguing with Reb Chia, what are you gaining by finishing the cut at the end? You cut it majority, you cut it too much, whatever that amount is on each loaf of bread. Of course, it's different, but you cut it too much, that's not a shalem. I don't care if you finish the bracha at the same moment that you cut it, and therefore you cut a complete loaf. No, it's not complete because it's majority, because a certain amount is, that amount is not enough to be called attached, to be considered one. It's not enough because once you cut it too much that you wouldn't be able to hold it by that piece, it's already considered severed. And that's what Rava's arguing with Reb Chia. Even if Reb Chia is saying finish the bracha at the same moment as you're slicing it, it's still not enough because you cut it too much that it legally is not called a shalem. That's the point. Anyway, so Tosfos doesn't. I'm just sharing that thought with you that went through that was bothering me, and I'm thinking that might be the answer. Now, the Tosfos doesn't mention that question or answer, but he just mentions this problem on Shabbos that if you do cut it too much, you would get into an issue where you might not have lechem mishnah, you might not have two loaves. What happens if your wife only bought 6 challahs or 4 challahs for Shabbos? And so it is shalashudas now, and you only have 2 challahs left. And if you mess up on one, you do not have lechem mishnah. You don't have the double bread that you're supposed to have. And so, or if you mess up on the Friday night, shalashudas, you're going to be stuck without having 2 breads. So whatever it is, you might not have enough loaves. So therefore, Tosfos's advice is better to make a hefsek, to make this interruption, than to get yourself into a problem of not having lechem mishnah. So obviously, it's legally not a hefsek. It's only like preferably to make this cut beforehand in the loaf. And on Shabbos, don't do it. Preferable during the week not to. On Shabbos, during the week, it's preferable to make a cut through the challah, but not, of course, not too much. And on Shabbos, Tosfos says better not to make any cut at all. And our tradition our custom is based on other views that mention to make some type of a mark in the bread. And that's what we do on Shabbos. Tosfos then brings something very interesting, and that is that the Jerusalem Talmud says that there is a benefit of reciting the bracha before you cut a piece off. And the reason is because if you cut the piece before you finish the bracha, what happens is your bracha is basically on that piece of bread, for that piece. Now, what happens if you cut it and by mistake, you cut your finger, and that piece of bread gets blood on it, and it's disgusting, and you're not going to eat it. Now, what happens if it falls to the floor and you're outside and there's dirt? It's a dirt floor. And so now you're not going to eat that slice. So you recited a bracha, you cut this slice that the bracha was recited while you were cutting, or the piece was cut it completely, or majority, or a nice amount of it was cut on the while you said that bracha. And like Rav Chia said, that you recite the bracha on that slice. While you slice it, you finish. So the Yerushalmi says there's a problem, because if that piece of bread falls to the floor, now you're going to need to cut a new piece of bread that you did not have in mind the bracha on. You didn't have in mind to recite the bracha on the next piece of bread. You had in mind to recite the bracha on this piece of bread. And if this piece of bread falls and gets dirty, you're going to need to recite a new bracha. Therefore, you know what? It's best to not have the piece of bread cut until you finish reciting the bracha. Now, let me just look at Tosfos over here. The Tosfos says that some bring a proof that you have to finish the bracha before you actually slice it off, because Reb Chia says in Yerushalmi that you don't recite a bracha you don't recite the bracha on the bread only while you are cutting it. And the reason is because if you finish cutting it before the bracha, so maybe a piece will fall and you will not be able to eat that piece, and you'll have to eat another piece, and you won't be able to eat the other piece without reciting another bracha, but you'll have to redo the bracha, and it'll be a bracha of atala. However, if you recite the bracha on the whole loaf and you don't cut it, you don't finish cutting it before the bracha, then if a piece falls, so the bracha that you recited on the loaf can go on any slice that you're going to cut from the loaf. So this is an interesting point that the Yerushalmi mentions. The commentaries argue over here on this point, and they discuss, are we talking about where you had in mind that you're only eating this slice for your whole meal? Or it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter. The fact that you recited the bracha on a certain slice, that slice has to be available to eat. And if you don't eat from that slice that you had in mind when you recited a bracha, then you have not fulfilled the bracha obligation in other words, that bracha goes in vain, and you would need to recite a new bracha on another slice. The Gemara there, the Yerushalmi does then ask, what about when you're drinking water at a stream? What happens then when you recite a bracha on the water at the stream? The water that you recited the bracha on is not there anymore, because you're going to be putting your mouth to the water, and you recited a bracha shahakol on the water, but the water continued flowing. So now it's the next flow of water that you're getting when it's time to drink it. So how in that case is it not a problem? How can you recite a bracha then on water that's in a stream if you're never going to have the water that you recited the bracha on there? And so on that, the Gemara answers that it's not a problem, because your mind is on the future water, not on this water that's in front of you. Your mind is on whatever water is going to be available when you finish the bracha. However, when you recite a bracha on bread and you slice the piece before, that bracha ends up being on that slice, and it ends up being that you didn't have if you don't eat that slice, you would need to say another bracha on a different slice of bread. So that's basically a statement from the Yerushalmi that Tosfos seems to it is brought in Shulchan Aruch. This of course based on that argument that I mentioned, but there is mention of it, which means that a person should be careful when they recite a bracha on something, that it shouldn't fall, and if it falls, and they might have to recite another bracha on if they're gonna take even though they're gonna take a similar item, but because they were reciting the bracha on that item, the bracha might go in vain, and they would need to recite another bracha. Susan, did you have a question? Someone had their hand up. Susan.